You can get on your high horse, can't you, and sneer at other people's sentiments or sensibilities. But I reckon almost everybody, when they heard the news this morning of John Prescott passing away, would have thought pretty quickly of the time he thumped someone who threw an egg at him, because that's the nature of a human relationship with media. He was, of course, much, much, much more than that, and few would know that better than Alastair Campbell, former Director of Communications in Downing Street, when John Prescott was the deputy. Can you remember the first time you met him, Alastair?
I was a journalist. And back then, he was a bit of a thorn in the side of Neil Kinnock quite a lot of the time. So he was had a bit of a rebellious streak. I always had a very good relationship with John, always. But yeah, we were back in the early 80s I first met John.
And what was his trajectory then through the sort of ranks of the party? How did he end up beside Tony Blair when victory finally came calling?
Well, he was always, he came from a trade union background, MP for 4 decades and more. And he was always a guy who was going to go places, I think. At that stage, a bit of an outsider, but then got into the shadow cabinet, challenged the leadership a couple of times. And by the time Tony became leader, after John Smith died, John was one of the other. John very cleverly went both for the leadership and the deputy leadership, knowing in his heart that Tony was probably going to win. And it meant that he was the elected deputy leader. And that became a really, really important relationship. People talk a lot about, TBGB, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and that was obviously very important. But John was an incredibly big part of the, if you like, the architecture of New Labour. He was the guy, people talk about him, I've heard a lot of the sort of commentary today, that he was the guy who was, the traditional what have you, and the trade union guy, much more old Labour. But he was the guy who coined the phrase, New Labour is traditional values in a modern setting. And that kind of, that was one that Tony felt very, very comfortable with. And sort of, for example, when we're doing the big modernising steps like changing the party constitution, John's initial instinct would be to be against why we're doing this. But then he was always persuadable if you had a really strong argument. And once he accepted an argument, he was absolutely out there, one of the best campaigners we had.
So a more thoughtful man than perhaps some of the public portrayals allow.
Yeah, definitely. Much more sophisticated, and his political instincts were extraordinary. He had really good political instincts. I think the reason why people maybe had the image of him that they did, one was the punch, which, as you say, became quite defining. It was also the fact, I remember once watching him doing an interview, and I said to him afterwards, I said, John, that is the longest sentence I've ever heard without a verb. He had no verb in it, but you knew what he was talking about. Yeah. And he was such a massive character. I was talking to somebody reminded me today, because when at a Labour Party conference, we'd all put all the effort into Tony's speech on the Tuesday, and then John would probably be closing the conference on the Friday. And so I used to help John with his speeches, and often it was about, giving him the sort of the kind of rather risque jokes that maybe Tony didn't want to use. But John wanted to rehearse everything, and he wanted to rehearse it in a big way. So I remember one night in the Imperial Hotel in Blackpool, 3:00 in the morning, Pauline asleep in the bed next door, and it was hot in the room. So we opened the windows, and the wind was howling and rain was coming. The curtains were sort of flying around. John at this stage had a shirt on, which he completely undone down to his waist. And he was doing this speech to the sea, but he didn't rehearse like I would rehearse.
That's like something out of King Lear. That's fantastic.
Well, it was. He was shouting at the sea. But he was a good orator. He was a great campaigner. But the thing about being more thoughtful, I thought it was very interesting today. One of the first tributes came from Al Gore, who was the vice president of the United States at the time of the Kyoto Agreement. John was absolutely fundamental to the success of those negotiations. He was a brilliant negotiator. He could keep people up all night. He would drill down on detail. He was a nightmare for interpreters. I remember once he was standing in for Tony at this big European conference, And I can remember looking at the interpreters, and at one point they were all in these cabins behind the meeting, and at one point the guy who was translating into German next to the guy who was translating into Finnish, and I remember, I'll never forget this, looking at them, and they're just going, shaking their heads and I don't know how to do this. You couldn't translate John Prescott.
Did he
He's a lovely man, and you know,
your warmth, your affection is really coming across, for which I'm really, really grateful. Did he suffer much from snobbery, do you think, in his career?
He certainly felt he did.
Yes.
And I think sometimes he slightly overdid it. But look, he felt the class thing very, very powerfully. He always used to. I remember Nicholas Soames, Old Etonian, Churchill's grandson, all that stuff. And once in the House of Commons, because John had been a waiter, John was up on his feet, and Nicholas Soames said, "I'll have a large G&T, Giovanni." And of course, it's actually quite funny, right?
Yes.
But John really took that sort of, because he felt that, to me, that's Nicholas Soames having a bit of laugh and trying to put him off his stride. To John, it was like, you don't ever want to see me as anything other than a waiter serving people like you. I'm the bloody Deputy Prime Minister and you better not forget it. So he sometimes could be very prickly about the class stuff. But also, I think it's what made him a special politician. I think it's what makes Angela Rayner a special politician. It's what made Dennis Skinner a special politician.
Well, you may have preempted my final question then by referencing Angela Rayner. Do you think it is easier now for someone to make a political journey like John Prescott's, from relative poverty to the pretty much the very top of the Labour Party, or harder, or roughly the same?
I don't think John would ever say that he came from a background as poverty stricken as Angela did, which was like,
true. Yes.
Her story is extraordinary. But listen, I think another way of looking at this is actually, do we have enough people in politics now coming from working class backgrounds, and do we have enough people in Parliament? But I think, look, John was a trailblazer in lots and lots of different ways. And I think it's great that you've got Angela Rayner there as Deputy Leader of the Labour Party. Clearly, she reminds people of John Prescott in the sort of directness, in the authenticity, in the passion that comes from her politics. But John should never, ever be underestimated. I think he sometimes was underestimated as a politician. He was a serious guy, cared about his politics, and he achieved an awful lot.
And a lovely man. There's an anecdote I don't think you'll have heard before, which I shall share with you now. It's just come in from Alice, who writes, when Chumbawamba threw water at him at the 1998 Brit Awards, I wrote to him to tell him how outrageous I, a 15-year-old girl, thought it was. And he phoned my family landline to say thank you. We were watching Corrie at the time, and my mum picked up the phone and said, "Alice, it's John Prescott for you."
No, I remember the Chumbawamba thing, because Chumbawamba came from Burnley, and I remember he phoned me up and he said, "Your bloody Burnley people are chucking water at me. What are you going to do about it?" John. I've got so many great memories of John, but it's so sad. We've got David Hill's funeral tomorrow, John dying today. It's
end of an era.
Too many good ones are going.
Alastair Campbell, thank you.